Hello and welcome to today's ASEN event on the Populism Interviews. Um, Delighted to be joined by the book's editor, Luca Manucci, and also by two of the contributors, Aurelian Mondon and Daphne Halikiopoulos. Uh, Populism is probably one of the most discussed, most controversial, most contested terms that is out there at the moment, and it's often thrown around in a really, I think, quite scattershot and inaccurate way. In his book, the Populism Interviews, Luca interviews various experts on populism and populists, indeed, looking at different theories on what populism is and isn't, what different approaches to populism are, then looking at the development of populism, what's caused it, and what in turn populism has caused, and then the issues and topics connected to populism. The Populism Interviews is published by Routledge, and I'll just briefly, pardon me, introduce our speakers today. We have Luca Manucci, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon in Portugal. His previous publications include Populism and Collective Memory, Comparing Fascist Legacies in Western Europe. Daphne Halikiopoulos is Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Reading and has written extensively on nationalism and the cultural and economic determinants of far-right party support. From January of next year, she will be Chair of Comparative Politics at the University of York. And Aurelian Mondon is Senior Lecturer in Politics at the University of Bath, where he currently works on various projects related to liberal and illiberal articulations of racism and right-wing populism and their impact on liberal democracies. I should always also mention, and with apologies to Luca because you weren't in there, Aurelian and Daphne were both cited quite a lot in my PhD thesis recently. So yes, for good or ill, that's where we are. For people joining us on Zoom, I know we've had some issues with Zoom today. My apologies for that. The recording will be available on YouTube and Facebook as per normal. So let's jump right to it, and I'm going to go around the panel and invite them to give their reflections on the process of taking part or creating the Populism Interviews in Luca's case. If you are watching us on Zoom, on Facebook, or on YouTube, do please feel free to ask any questions at any time, and I will feed them through to the panel. Luca, what gave you the idea for the Populism Interviews?
So, first of all, thanks, David, for introducing me, the book, and to ASEN for giving me the opportunity to present the book today, which we have here, the Populism Interviews. And it just came out in September for Routledge. It's been a long way. It's been a long way because I started with a blog, actually, in 2015. And over the time, I felt the urge to transform this online activity into something more permanent, and hence we have now the book. So let's start for a second from the blog called POP, Political Observer on Populism. It was born in 2015. Why? I was doing my PhD in Zurich at the time, at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. And I started in 2013. So we're talking about an era in which populism was, yes, relevant, but it was not yet the talk of the day. It wasn't making the headlines of every newspaper across the world. It was an important topic with a lot of literature on it, but not yet the post-2016 phenomenon. And in this regard, what Aurelian will tell us later is very significant. So at the time I was doing my PhD and I was researching the presence of populism in newspaper articles and party manifestos in 8 European countries from the 70s up to now. And I found myself thinking a lot about populism, what it meant, reading a lot of literature. As you know, in the first year of a PhD, what you tend to do correctly is to read all the literature or most of the literature available on that topic. And I realized several things. First, I realized that there were many topics, many issues that I considered super interesting, super relevant, but that didn't find a space in my, strictly speaking, academic production. For example, why Geert Wilders and Berlusconi had crazy hair. What's going on between Varoufakis and the Troika with all the memes that were originating about this. So I was finding myself contemplating the really funny elements of popular culture and you know the developments of the day-to-day, the austerity measures and left-wing populism in Southern Europe. And I found myself unhappy because what I had to research didn't necessarily follow the developments of the world during that period. And second, I realized that I kept reading more and more literature, and there were some names, some figures that started becoming familiar and that I wanted to know more about. And this is why were born the first interviews for the blog. For example, imagine I'm reading a lot of course, Cas Mudde, for example, who is one of the godfathers of populism studies. And after a while, I start thinking, okay, but these papers are old, you know, are 10 years old, some even more. Let's ask him what he thinks about today. So applying his theories, his work to today. For example, when there have been the 2016 elections in the US, I decided to ask Cas Mudde, how does your theory of populism travel to today's elections with Donald Trump, etc. So it was also a necessity to have an outlet out there where I could talk about things that were happening in that moment, and also hearing from great scholars on populism, their thoughts on current developments. Also because, as many of you might know, academia is mostly a horrific series of rejections. So by the time you want to write an article, a paper, and then you go and present the first draft to a conference, and then you implement the feedback, and then you submit it to a journal and get a desk rejection, and then you submit it again. The process can take years. And I really felt the urge to create a space, an outlet for reflections that were more immediate, that were more following the day-to-day of politics around the world. So the necessity for the book came from here, for the blog. And then the book came out of the necessity of putting all this work into a written form. So to my bewilderment, I wrote to Routledge asking, hey, what do you think about transforming the blog into a book? And Craig Foley, the editor for Social Sciences, told me, yeah, of course, we know the blog, it's great, let's do it. And for once, academia turned out not to be only a series of horrific rejections, and I felt encouraged to go on and continue with this project. So of these 30 interviews, 7 were already previously published on the blog and 23 are original. And even the 7 that were previously published on the blog have been updated because time passed, and also because I introduced one extra question to all the interviews, because I really wanted to ask this question to all the 32 experts in the book. How did you come to study populism? Why did you get interested in this topic? And which are the authors that really sparked your interest and shaped your understanding of this phenomenon? And here we are. This is how we went from a blog of reflections and interviews to having many years later a book where this reflection have been systematized and put into a larger frame.
Fantastic, thank you. Aurelian, do you want to jump in next?
Yeah, very happy to. Thanks for having me here, and thanks for Luca for putting all these interviews together. It's a brilliant project. I realized today actually that you interviewed me in 2015 about French populism. I haven't looked at the interview because I always find it very cringe-worthy to kind of look at what I've said before, so I try not to look at it. But yeah, and I wonder actually, maybe I will later on, just to see how much I've changed through the first interview to the second one we did together. So yes, I mean, it's been brilliant following your progress on this, and I think it's been a great resource, both the blog and the book and the breadth of all of this, and it really speaks to my work as well. I mean, you've been brilliant at putting questions to us, I think, and you've been brilliant at also making us think about about not just populism, but how, as academics, we talk about populism, which is something that I've been always very interested in. And in particular, in my work, how this might play into the mainstreaming of far-right politics. You know, why do we use the term populism as opposed to using the term far-right, extreme right, racists, and so on and so forth? And to me, I've always been amazed. I mean, I've always had this weird relationship with populism in a way, because it's something that has always attracted me, something that I spent a huge amount of time working on, but it's also something that I spent a huge amount of time criticizing for its misuses. And I do still believe that there are really important uses for the term populism, but I tend to come to the conclusion more and more that actually these uses are limited to very academic spaces, and that in public discourse, populism has been really too polluted to be useful and to actually refer to anything that is kind of helping us understand the world better. And one of the things that has always shocked me about populism and the dangers that populism brings is the fact that many far-right figures have tried to make themselves be called populist or welcome the term populist. We can think, of course, of Jean-Marie Le Pen in the 90s, Marine Le Pen in the 1990s, Marine Le Pen in the 2010s. Salvini, Matteo Salvini as well, not so long ago, Donald Trump and various others who, of course, welcome the term populism and sometimes even threaten to sue people who don't call them, or who call them extreme right, for example, like Marine Le Pen or Jean-Marie Le Pen. So to me, this careless kind of use of populism that we've seen and that has been well surveyed by Paxton and Hunger in a recent paper, in a way, is very problematic, because in my field it tends to legitimize the far right, as if the far right had democratic support, which it doesn't always have. It has too much support, of course, but not necessarily what we would call democratic support or majoritarian support. And this is something that I think, you know, your book and your work has allowed us to kind of explore a bit more, and certainly gave me the opportunity to discuss with you, which was great. What I was very conscious of when you asked me to do that interview as well is that I wasn't comfortable being called an expert. I don't necessarily like the term, and I also don't necessarily feel that my position is necessarily mainstream in my field of research as well. So it was interesting, and I was kind of happy that you asked me to do it, but it was a bit strange. And what I was trying not to do was, or what I didn't want to come across as someone who is policing the field, and I know that some people have thought, but that's what I'm trying to do. This is how you should use populism, or this is how you should not use populism, and that's not what I'm trying to do at all. There are people who know far more than I do about populism that I've built on, with my research and things like that. And I do think that there's a place for populism in research. What I'm trying to do really is just go back to basic academic scrutiny, really, which is we need to be careful with the words we use. The words we use have a meaning, and the impact we have as academics has a meaning as well. And I think we need to take our roles far more seriously. And so, it is, from my point of view, very important that we think about these things very, very carefully. And I think, again, your book is allowing us to do that for all these interviews, and for making us reflect about the work we've done, 10, 15, 20 or so years ago. So what you were saying about, about going back to people to talk to them about how they feel about their work now, I think is very important, because that's what we need to do. We need to reflect upon our practice, really, as academics. So, what I quite liked as well in your interview was when you asked me what my advice would be to people wanting to study populism. And I think it's not just about newcomers. I think it's also about the people who have jumped on the bandwagon, the people who have become comfortable with their research, like I probably am at the moment as well, and the fact that we don't want to challenge ourselves necessarily all the time, because we can take it personally, or we can become defensive about these kind of things. And I think what we really need to ask ourselves when we want to study populism, or when we use the word populism in research, in the media, and so on, is whether it is really populism we're talking about, or whether we're actually talking about something else. And whether using, not just that, but also whether using the term populism is helping our audience, whether that audience is academic or more mainstream, whether it's helping our audience understand the world around us, which it is not necessarily the case, unfortunately. For example, I try to be very careful with the way I use populism, but I also need to think about the way it's going to be read by the people who are going to be reading my work, and whether they will actually understand what I mean by populism. So I think what we need to be careful of is these kind of effects that are around populism and populist hype, the bandwagon effect, for example, and various other issues that I think are problematic when we think about basic academic integrity. So I think we need to really be careful and remain far more open-minded about about the way we use populism. We need to continue reflecting. We need to continue learning. And I think, you know, your kind of projects, whether it is your blog or your book, really has allowed us to do that, or certainly allowed me to do that. And yeah, I was really pleased to be part of it. So thank you so much, Luca.
I would like to say one thing before we give the word to Daphne, because you touched a very important point, in my opinion. Who is an expert? So, first of all, the book is called The Populism Interview, a dialogue with leading experts. I didn't like the subtitles because I didn't want this subtitle, but then Routledge wanted it. But my point was that when I selected the 32 experts, they are experts because I think they are. But in my opinion, it wasn't the point to bring the 32 most experienced people in the world who study populism. It was to give a sort of, you know, playlist that I like. Those that make research on populism that are experts, but also that I find relevant and interesting. And also I wanted a mixed bag of senior researchers with a reputation and etc. And also mixed with more younger scholars, with emerging scholars who do cutting-edge research, who maybe published a paper on populism. And at the same time, I wanted also someone who came from different disciplines into populism, because I think it allows to gain greater depth about the topic. And so I just wanted to clarify this. When I selected these experts, it was my taste. It was younger and senior scholars, and it was those who only do research on populism, but also those who arrived to populism from somewhere else.
Thanks. And on that note, Daphne.
Thank you. Aurelian, I definitely consider you an expert, so I'm not sure why you don't consider yourself one, but I certainly do. Luca, congratulations. I also have it with me. I'm traveling, in fact, for work, and I'm reading a few interviews at a time. I revisited Aurelian's interview on the train on the way here. And I think actually I'm going to start exactly where you left off, and maybe that makes it a little bit boring, because usually we should have like a big disagreement and clash, but actually I completely agree with you. I don't really think it's populism that we're talking about in most cases. I think it's something else. And so in my own interview, which was also quite a while when we did first the blog, but then we updated it clearly. I focus more on the relationship between populism and nationalism. And I suppose the underpinning argument that I'm making is that it's really nationalism that is driving this rather than populism. And this is something that I've said in a lot of other work that I have done on far right parties. So I approached the topic from the angle of the far right. And when I started working on this, it was the far right. And all of a sudden I became a populism expert somewhere along the lines, and I didn't exactly realize when that happened. So I did worry. I think one of my concerns is that we're just alternating terminology to refer to certain challenger parties with some perhaps authoritarian, anti-democratic, definitely nationalist / nativist agendas. So what I was trying to do in this interview is sort of to synthesize a lot of the work that I have done on this by making three distinct points. The first is that actually populism and nationalism are very different, and very often, again, as Aurelian said, I don't want to prescribe how we should be studying things, but I think it's also really important to be able to delineate terms and clarify what outcomes and what processes we're trying to explain. So I think while populism and nationalism are very often conflated because they both involve a dichotomy between an insider and an outsider group, if you like. In the case of populism, that's sort of the people versus the elite. So the people is the good one, the insider, if you like, and then the elite is those that need to be excluded or those that we need to be mobilizing against. For nationalism, an in-group and the out-group is something very, very different, right? And this is very often, whether defined in ethnic or civic terms, it's defined very differently. So I think, in other words, you can be a populist and not be a nationalist, and you can also be a nationalist but not be a populist, right? So these things are very different. Now, looking specifically, my second point that I made, looking specifically at far-right parties, which is what really I work on, my work indicates that it is while these parties do have a populist rhetoric, very often it is the nationalism dimension that mobilizes support. So nationalism is very much in the supply. And one thing I've noticed is that, especially in Western Europe, parties that adopt civic nationalist narratives tend to be more attractive to voters. So what we're witnessing is sort of this shift in rhetoric. Parties no longer say, oh, you know, I'm a racist, or we should exclude people on the basis of race, because that's a no-no, right? That's a stigma. But instead, they say, oh no, we should exclude on the basis of certain ideological criteria. These people are ideologically intolerant. They are terrorist threats. You know, they threaten the very premise of the liberal democratic order that defines us. So they essentially put a civic framing in what is an exclusionary agenda. And I think that makes them both more attractive and also, second, far more difficult to address, because as Aurelian said, and I completely agree with him there, that mainstreamizes them, right? It makes them, the line between extreme and mainstream becomes very blurred. Just a tiny little example. I was listening to mainstream Greek radio the other day, or what I consider to be mainstream, and they were discussing Meloni's election. And the producer, or whatever, the person who had the radio show, he was talking, he had invited a guest saying, oh, but how is it possible that Meloni is far right when everybody has congratulated her? And then the guest was, of course not, she's not far right. Everyone in Europe has congratulated her. So I think this is an excellent example of how, you know, somehow the extreme enters the mainstream, and calling themselves populist makes that really happen. So Luca's question to me in the interview was, well, what do we do then? How do we address this phenomenon, especially since it's become so difficult to tackle? And so here, I think my recommendation, if possibly as an academic I can have one, you know, academics are notorious for analyzing, but less good at prescribing policy solutions. But one thing that stems from my work is, I think that co-opting that message is not a successful strategy for others, especially not for progressives. And I think in simple terms, that's because, you know, people prefer the original and not the copy. Those who have very strong nationalist tendencies will vote for nationalist parties regardless. Those who are what we call the peripheral voters, you know, those who are basically attracted because of other reasons, would prefer a party that tackles their insecurities rather than a party that is copying some kind of exclusionary nationalist agenda that they disagree with. So yeah, I'll stop here and wait for more questions.
Okay, let me throw a question to everybody. Cos'è il populismo? Tiene laichismos? Qu'est-ce que c'est le populisme? What is populism? And I apologize for my mangling of your respective languages there. What is populism? And I think I mean two things by that. One is, like, descriptively, what is it? When you say populism, what do you mean by populism? But also, what kind of thing is populism? Is it something that's just descriptive? Is it a philosophy? Is it a methodology that political parties can use? What kind of thing is it, if that makes sense?
I'm trying to start here, but I'm going to disappoint you, David, because first of all, I am afraid we are all again going to agree on what is populism. I know you set as a trap. You want us to start fighting about finding the correct definition for populism. But honestly, I think the biggest lesson I learned from editing this book of interviews is that we have to bust this myth that populism is a controversial topic. It is maybe fine, but when I started, especially 10 years ago, and for the following years, every single paper I read on populism at a certain point had to say, populism is a contested topic. Populism is difficult to define. Now, I do define it following Kasmude that I cited before as a thin ideology that opposes the pure people and the corrupt elite. Now, whether you want to define it in stylistic terms, in organizational terms, ideational terms, etc., I think we all do agree with the fact that it's the opposition between elites and the people. And honestly, if you read one interview of this entire book, trying to figure out what is populism, read the first interview, which is there for a reason, at number 1, with Benjamin Moffat, who takes indeed the main definitions of populism and shows on what they differ and on what they come close to each other. And I would say the main lesson here is really that we might disagree on nuances, we might disagree on, you know, some definitional aspects, but on what is populism, I would say there is a very strong agreement. But maybe Aurelian and Daphne will say the exact opposite, and we will have the fight we were hoping for.
So yeah, so Daphne, can we all start writing populism as a contested concept in our papers?
Let me slightly disagree, ever so slightly, just a tiny bit, to, you know, to spice it up a bit. I think so. As a feature, elite against the people, you know, I think okay, that's fine. There is something as a description. David mentioned a description, but I think the disagreement comes into analytically what that means. Now, my difficulty that I'm struggling with this is in a way that it's very difficult to have a counterfactual to populism if we define populism as you know, the people versus the elite. In other words, in a sort of, you know, democratic system where parties function, it's very difficult to find a party that doesn't somehow talk a bit about the elites and the people, right? So in a way, if we stretch it, I can prove to you, give me any party that you want, and I'll give you the manifesto, and I can prove to you that somehow it's made some populist, it has some populist rhetoric, made some populist claims. Then we can go into questions of measurement. How many claims? Does it have to make many claims? Does it have to be ideology? But again, that's very difficult to measure, because who are you going, you know, are you going to look at speeches? Who are you going to look at? So I think the difficulty with populism is that it becomes this all-encompassing concept that in a way nothing can be outside it by definition, right? And therefore it may, if we stretch that concept very much, lose its analytical utility. So and in addition, I think another difficulty that I have with populism, so we have the mini-maxi definition, right? So the minimum is the elite and the people, but then because scholars say, well, obviously every party talks about the elite and the people, then let's add to it, we add new categories. But the problem with that as well is the minimum in itself, again, all parties talk about the elites and the people. Also, we have, how are we going to operationalize that? Let's think in practice. Let me see if I want to look at it, where will I find it? Will I look at, but I have, you know, anti-democratic, I have challenger variables. Why do I need the populism? How can I distinguish between an indication of populism versus an indication of anti-establishment rhetoric or anti-democracy rhetoric? So this is one thing. But then let me go into the maxi and say, well, it has to be people versus the elite plus something else, nationalism. But then populism becomes redundant. If I have nationalism, then it's nationalism that explains it. So why did I need to look at populism in the first place? Now, can I just clarify here? I'm not by any means saying that populism, you know, we should, I mean, I am one of the co-authors of this. I mean, I work on the populist team. I think populism can be a useful and analytical category, but I think these are important things that we need to think about to prevent it from becoming just, you know, just something, just a big umbrella. I don't like something, I call it populist, and then I take it for granted, and then I move on and I look for different variables and I say, oh, this is then populist. We're reading into it in a way, but this is my 2 pence.
If it explains everything, it doesn't actually explain anything at all. Really,
I mean, if I can jump in, I mean, I broadly agree. I mean, and I think you made like lots of good points, Daphne, as well. I think what's interesting as well is that none of this is new. And again, I always tend to go back to Kazmed's 2007 work, where he says very, very clearly, it should be called the populist radical right and not radical right populism, because populist is just an adjective. It just adds to radical right politics. What matters is radical right politics. And what I find fascinating is that, as you said, Luca is one of the godfathers of populism, and everyone kind of cites him usually when, people start with saying it's a contested topic, and so therefore I'm going to use Kazmede, but I haven't really read him. So I'm just going to misuse him in a way. And then people go on to talk about right-wing populism or just populism without actually talking about what we're talking about. But what's interesting is that if we go back to early Kaz, then populism is an add-on. It's not central. Unfortunately, then it took off, and so people started using it very, very carelessly. But populism was always an add-on, and I think it adds something. But I think on its own, it's meaningless in a way. Partly, but because of what Daphne was saying about, well, lots of politics could be argued to be the people versus the elite, but also because it's been imbued, I think, and that's quite important as well in our definitions of populism. And I think that's where there is something that matters about definitional debates about populism. It's been imbued with some kind of normative element in politics as well, and with some moral element in politics. And I think this is probably where some of the most interesting research on populism today, and I'm talking about research on populism, not research on the far right nationalism and things like that, but research on populism today is coming out, is the people studying anti-populism. The way, by talking about populism in a certain way, we actually push an anti-populist sentiment. And I think this is absolutely fascinating. And some people have done some absolutely brilliant work on this. And I think we need to think about this as well. What does it do when we talk about populism in certain ways, and in certain ways that imbue the populist with some kind of moral element? And I think it's helped strengthen certain politics over others. It's conflated certain politics with others, which that shouldn't be conflated in a way. Because, as I think Daphne said in her introductory note, populism can be positive, can be negative. You can have nationalists, you can have populists that are nationalists, and you can have populists who are not nationalists. You can have populists who are inclusive, you can have populists who are not. And I think the problem is when you start actually using populist as a noun, like this person is populist, or as a kind of main definer, then you conflate people from Podemos to the far right. And that's completely useless. I mean, I don't understand why we can find this useful unless we're really interested in looking at the way these people construct their people. But generally, that's not what we're doing. And I think there's a value in doing that, in looking at the way the people and the elite are constructed through different groups. But generally, a lot of people who are using the term populism as a main definer are not looking at that. They're looking at nationalism. They're looking at the far right. They're looking at anti-liberal politics, or people who are just slightly disagreeing with the liberal democratic settlement at the moment, and so on. And I think it's just making things far more confused from my point of view. So I think one thing that I find quite interesting and still contested in these definitions is actually the way populism has been shown as negative. And I think this is a problem, because populism doesn't have to be negative necessarily. And in fact, the fact that it's suggesting that we cannot almost criticize the elite. But we live at a time of incredible discontentment in democracy, and criticizing the elite, I think, has a space, and it doesn't have to be an illiberal space, and it doesn't have to be an extreme authoritarian space. I think there are very good reasons to criticize the elite at times when people feel completely disconnected. Otherwise, I think we're not doing our role.
But how do you distinguish between criticizing the elite and populism? Because otherwise we're back in the same place, and anyone criticizing the elite is a populist.
Absolutely, but it could be. Populism for me, and I think that's where we agree. I mean, populism for me is like the construction of a people against an elite that is also constructed, right? Which is incredibly broad. But you can, the elite can be an elite that's constructed under racist terms, like, so, it could be, Jewish people, for example, or it could be, Brussels, or it could be, in racialized, nationalized terms, or it could be an elite that is more kind of the elite based on socioeconomic factors as well. So it doesn't have to be exclusive, inclusive. I mean, it can be inclusive, it can be exclusive. The people could be the nation, could be the race, or it could be the working class, or it could be the 99%. You know, they are completely different things. Some are inclusive, some are exclusive. But of course, there is an antagonism there somewhere.
Daphne.
Thank you, David. My moment to disagree with Aurélien has arrived. So when Luca added the first question about how you approach populism in the interviews, which I don't know if you've looked at, but I departed from the classic names that people usually refer to, and referred specifically to Riker's definition. And I know that is something that people tend to not look at for some reason. It's a shame I don't have that book to show because I'm traveling. But what I find fascinating about Riker's definition is that he understands beyond, is it an ideology and is it a rhetoric and, you know, all that. He centers on the question of the extent to which populism is a vision of collective choice. Or in other words, populism is about how we make decisions in society collectively and how we legitimize those decisions. So what kind of societal decisions are legitimate? Now, according to populism, the only legitimate and indeed moral way to make decisions is to elevate is from below, right? So the collective will, the will of the people. Now that I think that's quite a fascinating concept to look at, right? So what it tells you is you take some people, because there isn't such a thing as a unified will of the people, right? In a society, you have many different people and they have different wills and some are actually clashing. But what populism does, re-Brexit, for example, is it takes the will of some people, it elevates it to the will of the people in capital, and then that is the legitimate and the only way about it. So in other words, the will of the minority is excluded. So if indeed we understand populism as a way of making legitimate collective choices, and the way is we basically, the majority rules and the minority needs to be quiet, I think there is a tendency there for authoritarianism, regardless of where on the political spectrum that comes from, right? Because then there is a problem in that we don't accept reaching consensus. We just accept the majority rules, and then that's the end of it. So as I said, so I think, for example, the way Brexit was conducted is an example of that, in my opinion, perhaps far more than some far-right party, which is more about nationalism. But this is a controversial view.
Sorry, if I may, that does suggest you're adding a normative thing, that populism is bad. Or am I misunderstanding?
I'm not seeing it as, well, if you see authoritarianism as bad, then you can say, but I guess analytically what I'm saying, that's an extrapolation, right? Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is that inherently, populism is about making some views quiet, is about not achieving consensus, is about not recognizing that consensus is necessary in multidimensional democracies. And if you want to call that a bad thing, I'm with you.
But isn't this true then of every electoral element of democracy, of what we consider democracy today in that case?
Well, not consensus systems necessarily. So there
well, but yeah, I mean, but you know, looking, for example, at the UK or looking at France, you know, the winner takes all at the end of the day, right?
Yes.
So is that populist?
No, but I think it's the same.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and the logic is there. But it's fascinating. I haven't thought about it, but yeah.
But again, is this not leading us out into the same problem as before, where populism is just meaning too much? Because if populism is something we're using to analyze the problems of the Westminster majoritarian system, and Podemos and Hugo Chavez and Giorgia Meloni, does it still have, I mean, what's the analytical use of it here? If we say this is, you know, if we say under Riker's definition or Mood's definition, this is populist, what is that actually telling us? What's that adding to our understanding of a particular party or movement or whatever it happens to be?
Well, I would like to intervene here, because I think all these reflections are great, and I think they're really, really important. But as Aurelian said before, not always talking of populism is relevant. So there is one issue, which is conceptual clarity, definitions. What is populism? And I think on that there is quite a strong agreement. Then there is a second layer of this issue, which is populism in this situation relevant to describe it, to analyze it? So, for example, we talked about Giorgia Meloni. Giorgia Meloni was recently elected prime minister in Italy. And unfortunately, I've been reading some Italian news after quite some time, and I discovered that she is never called radical right, despite all the political scientists out there define Meloni's party, Fratelli d'Italia, as a radical right party. Now, why is this the case? This is not a matter of definition. What is populism? This is, even admitting she is a populist, which I don't think she is, but let's say she is a populist. What she is doing, the policies she will propose, the government she formed have nothing to do with populism. I've read definitions about her that say that she's a center-right person. She's not. That she's a populist, even if she is, that is obscuring rather than revealing information. I've read that she is of the sovereignism type, like national sovereignty. Indeed, she also introduced a minister for food sovereignty. Anyway, so sovereignism, center-right, populism, these are all terms that even if she was a populist, they wouldn't help us at all understanding the situation. Then on how it became a derogatory term, a negative term, populism, I suggest everybody to read the interview to Anton Jäger, who actually takes a sort of philological approach and goes back to the 19th century in the US and shows how then in the 20th century the term arrived in Europe and then gradually took a completely derogatory and negative meaning. And just two more things. It's also a matter of measurement, right? So which parties are populist and which people have populist attitudes? And I think on this, there is still a lot of work to do, especially on the populist attitudes at the individual level, because on which parties are populist, we have, for example, the populist. We have other resources. In the book, I interview Maurits Meyers about the POPA, which is a project about mapping hundreds of parties in Europe over time and defining them as more or less populist. And in the book, I also interview Andrzej Zaslowy, who's one of the first to try to measure populism at the individual level. So do people have populist attitudes? And especially here, I think there is some more work to really fine tune these measurements. But again, there's been also a lot of work done. And I really encourage everybody who works with populism to read the classics, to read the really important work, to not reinvent the wheel every time, because this is really the risk in a field like populism, where every day there are chapters, books, special issues, conferences, events on populism, and the risk is really high to ignore decades of great work on populism and try to reinvent the wheel. And as Daphne was saying, then we end up saying that populism is nationalism, which is a barbarism. It's really not the case. And it's true that the risk is also to lose sight of the meaning of the word. And then, as you were all saying before, doesn't it risk to obscure rather than reveal? And that's precisely what happens. So I close with this recommendation, which is to read the interview number 10 with Matthijs Vodijn, one of those who have been studying populism in Europe for a very long time now. And it's a meta interview in the sense that it's an interview not about a specific aspect of Matthijs' research, but a reflection upon studying populism. So which myths we need to avoid, what assumptions that are wrong we need to discard, what kind of research avenues in the future there are for populism scholars. And I really recommend whoever wants to do research on populism to read this interview as well.
On that, let me ask another question to everybody. This being the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and nationalism has come up. What is the relationship between populism and nationalism? I mean, everyone is saying that they don't have to go together. They seem to go together an awful lot of the time. And indeed, you know, non-national populism seems to quite often end up using what looks like quite a lot like national language. I'm thinking of Podemos here, who can they seem to me to be populists, but I'm not an academic, so I can be sort of political and normative and say they look quite nice and so on. But some of what they're saying seems to be, at least if nothing else, in a national frame. Aurelian, you look like you want to come in.
I do, but I mean, Daphne is really the expert on nationalism, so yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? But I mean, I think that's a fascinating question, and I'd love to actually hear what Luca and Daphne think about this. But to me, again, that speaks more to the conflation that we make with populism and a lot of other terms. And of course, a lot of populist actors will fall into nationalism, but it's not because populism and nationalism are necessarily linked, but it's because nationalism remains, in a lot of the politics we study and take into account, it remains the basis of what we consider politics today: electoral politics, sovereignty, all of these kind of things, right? So I mean, the nation is still so incredibly powerful in our kind of common political psyche that of course a lot of populists will come back to nationalist tropes because they fight nationalist elections at the end of the day, or national elections, or nationalist elections. I guess we could put it this way. And I think this is why eventually quite a lot of populists, even left-wing populists, we fall back towards these kind of things, these kind of values. Personally, I think this needs to be again taken carefully because it's not set in stone. It's down to kind of what is the hegemonic setting nowadays, and the hegemonic setting of politics remains the nation. If we overcome the nation, and if we have just the EU as the kind of new national space, then maybe we'll find that populism will be about Europe rather than the EU, rather than the nation, for example. But from my point of view, this is where the link is that we still haven't managed to overcome the nation as our political horizon. Sorry, that was really mumbled, but hopefully that made a little bit of sense. Yeah.
Actually, I take the opportunity to link this and ask to Daphne something that I've been thinking about, exactly about this, and I don't have an answer. So having the expert here, I think it can help. I was also thinking another classic misunderstanding is to link nationalism to only radical right or extreme right politics. In particular, now that I moved to Iberia, let's say to Portugal, but also interested in Spain, I see that also radical left parties here have some form of nationalism, although they call it patriotism. So what they really want is not the nation, but the patria in Spanish. But so I was wondering, is there anything as left-wing populism combined with nationalism? Is it possible? Does it make sense? What do you think?
Thanks for that lovely question. I have just the article that I have written for you to read with Sophia and Kyriaki 10 years ago. It's The Paradox of Nationalism at EJPR. And we actually look at, basically this paper looks at far right and far left parties and the extent to which they justify their Euroscepticism on nationalism. And we do find paradoxically, and I know Aurelian will disagree perhaps here with some points, but we do find that, hence the paradox of nationalism, that paradoxically there is a relationship also between the left and nationalism. And I think if we go elsewhere, I know we're departing ever so slightly from populism now, I'll come back, but if we look at various left movements as well, they have also been nationalist, right? So if you look at the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and if you look at the Soviet Union, and if you look at various and there is a lot of work that's done on that. Now, where I agree with Aurelian is I think that indeed, and this is part of our conclusion, that given that the framing that we operate in is one of, the nation is the dominant part, it does make sense ultimately, I don't know whether their ideology is necessarily compatible, their ideology is necessarily in favor of nationalism, or whether they do it to depart from their ideology in order to meet the requirements of existing in a modern nation state, if you like. But I think, and we can debate that, but I think indeed, and we did in that paper, we did a quantitative analysis, and then we did qualitative analysis of Greece and France. And indeed, again, I think that the left in both cases makes some very strong nationalist claims, especially in the way that it contradicts Europe. We did find, however, to get back to my ethnic civic distinction, that the right tends to focus more on both ethnic and cultural, whereas the left tends to make it more civic in many respects and more economic. But to go back to populism and nationalism as well, I think the reason they are conflated is because they both, as I said in the beginning, they both emphasize dichotomies, right? So they both have this us group that we must defend versus this outside group that we need to oppose. And so I think this dichotomy is often conflated, despite the fact that the in-group and out-group are different in both cases. But I don't know if that problem then stems from what we really wanted to explain was the rise of the far right, and then somewhere along the lines we just called it populism and that's the end of it. I don't know if that's the problem, but distinguishing between the two, and again, as I said earlier, analytically, at least theoretically, they must be able to be different, else they're a tautology, right? So we must be able to find, even in our imagination, the possibility that an actor or a party is nationalist and not populist and vice versa, right? If that doesn't exist, then our categories are completely flawed and circular.
I'm going to jump in there with a question on that. Is populism ever not of the extremes? Coming from Rachel in chat, but you know, I'm going to broaden that. I think we've mentioned it a little bit before, but okay, I'm going to put the challenge to you. Where are the populist non-nationalists and the non-nationalist populists? And more broadly, can you have a populism of the centre?
Interesting question. Okay, let me give this a go. I think that somehow, and this is again, okay, this is a very difficult question to answer, because if you answer yes, then again it's a tautology, because every single party can be populist, and so that's a problem. But if you answer no, then again it's the maxi question, right? Then again you might be conflating it with some nationalist or some other type of party. I think another thing that I find interesting in relation to this discussion is that we tend to kind of see populism, maybe that's the normative element Aurelian was talking about, as somewhere in between radical and somewhere in between mainstream and extreme is the radical dimension that we equate populism with, right? So if I tell you the Golden Dawn, you'll say no, the Golden Dawn is not populist because it's extreme. But of course, Marine Le Pen is populist because she's veering closer to the radical. And again, this fascinates me because my reading of fascist literature, you know, classics, Michael Mann and Juan Linz and lots of classics explaining fascism, tend to agree that populism is one definition or one part of the definition of fascism, which is the total extreme, which complicates matters even more, right? So is it because of a normative reason that we only associate? Do we say populism, in other words, is it some kind of anti-establishment party that supports the people? Is that what we mean by populism really? And that's why we can't accept it being extreme, and we can't accept it being mainstream because that's the establishment? Or are we again blurring categories? Luca can shed light. I know you have an interview that talks about fascism actually, and I haven't read it, I admit, so I'd be interested.
Well, I'll jump in, and indeed I was thinking about 2 interviews in the book that go exactly in the direction of this discussion. The first is Mattia Zulianello, who in the interview claims exactly this, that there is right-wing populism, left-wing populism, but there is also valence populism, especially in Eastern Europe. And these are parties that are not exactly centrists, like in the left-right spectrum in the middle, not really, but like Five Star Movement in Italy, these are parties that insist on valence issues, such as we need less corruption, we all agree it's a valence issue. We need more democracy, we all agree it's a valence issue. So there is definitely the possibility, even empirically observable, to have a disjunction between radicalism and populism. This exists, it is a thing, and if you want to know more, go and read the interview to Mattia Zulianello. The second thing is that, yes, there is always this link between populism and fascism. And about this, there is the interview with Federico Finkelstein, who's a historian from Argentina who works in New York. And it's illuminating because he shows very interestingly how after 1945, fascism becomes a taboo, obviously. Italy and Germany are defeated, and you can't claim to be a fascist. So what happens? In Latin America, the various Perón, Getulio Vargas, etc., use populism to reintroduce certain illiberal authoritarian elements typical of fascism in a democratic way. So in this scenario, you can have democracy, you can have elections, and you can also have illiberal authoritarian elements that you reintroduce thanks to populism. So historically, populism has had exactly this function. And if you allow me, I think the circle is almost complete in the sense that populism has served historically to bring back certain authoritarian illiberal elements into the political debate to make them acceptable and democratic. And we are close to arrive at the closure of the circle in which you don't need populism anymore to make these things acceptable. You can have a Meloni who doesn't need populism to produce a neo-fascist rhetoric that wins the elections. So I don't know if I went too far with this, but I think these two interviews that I mentioned speak really to the issue we were discussing.
I mean, it does make me think a little bit, and I may be completely misremembering what he said, but Vilfredo Pareto, who I'm sure, was talking about sort of 20%, 80%, and that's a good thing, that he was definitely a fascist, but he was very much on the side of the elites being in charge. Anyway, that's probably by the by. Aurelian, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean that's what's fascinating about fascism and about calling the far right populist in general is that they are incredibly elitist ideologies, right? And yet we fall for that. And of course, they make claims to representing a people, but that people is represented in very hierarchical ways as well. And I think that's fascinating. And the fact that they're trying to claim populism is interesting. But I wanted to go back to a previous point about your question, where when you asked whether whether there can be a populism of the center. Well, first, I think the question we need to ask ourselves is what is the center? What is mainstream? And we tend to reify that. We tend to reify the mainstream as if there was something, because we all feel that we know what the center is. We may feel we're part of it. We may feel it's reasonable. We may feel it's open, it's consensual, and all of these kind of things. But is it that simple, right? Let's just imagine something that is not necessarily that far off, and that in fact is happening in places where that we would consider fairly, mainstream in terms of politics, at least until recently. Let's think about women's rights or gay rights, LGBTQ plus rights. Yeah, let's think about a country that starts removing these kind of rights from people, where a tiny minority of people who have been elected more or less well by only so many people with massive discontentment starts removing the rights of these people to have abortions, to vote, to get married, and so on and so forth. You could then have a coalition of people who get together and say, we represent the people, which would be women, which would be LGBTQ plus community, maybe migrants, refugees, and things like that, in a chain of equivalence. And these people would then be, a populist movement potentially, right? Bringing together the people against an elite. And it takes us back to the argument before, which again is interesting because I see where you're going, and I have sympathies with that. But would that be authoritarian necessarily to want to remove an elite that is threatening the very humanity and rights of certain communities? Or would leaving that elite in power be what would be authoritarian? And I think that's again fascinating. That's what brings up the interesting discussion that populism brings up, and that's why I'm always, no matter how much I want to put meaning into populism, I always try to rein it back in and remember that populism is at the end of the day, from my point of view, the most useful way to look at populism is looking at it in a very kind of hollowed out way, which is, the very kind of simple, basic construction of a people versus an elite, without any kind of moral judgment attached to it. The people doesn't have to be pure. The people can be in fact not pure at all, can be very disconnected. But the example that I've given you about, which is loosely based on the US nowadays, women, LGBTQ plus communities, migrants, they don't have to be a pure united people. They can be very different communities just getting together to say we want equal rights. And these equal rights then come into play against an elite that is not morally corrupt either necessarily, unless we think again in ways that I think are problematic, which would mean that the mainstream is this and that, and morally is this and that. So I think what we need to really pay attention to is not redefining concepts such as the mainstream, because again, like looking at women's rights, looking at LGBTQ plus rights, they were not mainstream that long ago. They are now. Things change very quickly and always have. And I think the problem is when we start thinking about the mainstream in these ways, then we start forgetting that actually the people has a very different definition nowadays than it had, not so long ago, and can have many different definitions. And that's why I'm always wary about seeing populism as a negative force, because when you think about populism, you think about the people, and it can quickly lead to, and that's obviously not what we did today, but it can quickly lead to actually the delegitimization of the people as a force for democracy. And I think, we need to be careful with that. And I'm not saying that we need a pure people, or that there is such a thing as the people, but I think the concept of the people is an important one that we need to keep thinking about carefully, rather than dismissing as the left behind, as Trump supporters and things like that, because we give legitimacy to Trump, but we delegitimize the people as we do that as well. Again, mumbled answer, but there you go.
So this is going to bring me on. I mean, we've got about a quarter of an hour left. This is going to bring me on to something else that's come up in the discussion, and it's something you were alluding to earlier, Aurélien. Is the way academics discuss populism causing populism, or at least causing the term to be used more? Can I turn around and blame you three and all the experts in the book and so on for everybody talking about populism all the time? And to ask a slightly less silly question, how should the academic study of populism translate into the public sphere?
If I can jump in very quickly on this, if it's all right, because that's something that I've just been studying recently, and I just have an article that's been fully accepted yesterday on exactly on this. What I did, thank you, Daphne.
Are you allowed to say which journal?
Acta Politica, yeah, I think I am. Hopefully I am, and I really recommend it. The editors were absolutely brilliant. So yeah, if you're thinking about submitting something, I recommend it. And what I did is that I looked at all the articles that have been published in English in academic journals in the last 5 years that had the words in the abstract or title: radical right, populist right, extreme right, far right, populist radical right. There were 2,500 articles in total, which already tells us something, right? 2,500 articles in 5 years. So since 2016, I took 2016, obviously, for obvious reasons, right? Trump, Brexit, and all of this. 2,500 articles. Then what I did is I looked at the titles and abstracts, because I think that's what frames our research. That's what we put out there. That's how we hook our readers, right? How we get them to read our work. And what I found was the terms that were most used were, the first one was far right, which I thought was fascinating, because far right is not very well defined. It's a bit like populism to some extent. Extreme right, radical right, people have spent countless years defining them. Far right, there are very few definitions out there, actually, when you look at it, which is interesting. Some of them are starting to come up, but anyway, far right is the most used term. The second most used term is populism, which I think is, again, fascinating, right? Because we all agree that populism is contested to different extents, but we also all agree that populism is not central. Very few people, when they talk about populism seriously, would say populism is central to all these things. And yet that's the term we use second most after far right. I mean, there are other things in the article, but I'm not going to talk about. But I think that's fascinating, because I cannot believe that the second most interesting information about the far right today is populism, or the biggest threat from the far right is populism. Nationalism doesn't rate that much, for example, Daphne, in my research, which is interesting. Nativism, not that much either. And so, yeah, all of this I think is interesting. And I think there has been a populist hype that some other people have studied better than I have as well. So, and we need to be more careful, because, of course, we tend to think that we live in ivory towers and that no one listens to what we write and only 5 people read our articles and so on. But I don't think that's entirely true. I think people listen to what we say, and people use us as well to legitimize their views and their policies and so on. So I think we need to be far more careful. I don't think we are responsible for populist hype alone, and as Lucas said, some politicians had jumped on that bandwagon a long time ago, right, because it's useful. But I think we need to be more careful in our analysis of it and not fall in the traps that actually the far right is setting for us.
On this, I have just one very brief comment, then I let Daphne reply too. But I wanted just to mention before I forget that the interview with Matthijs Rodijn that I mentioned earlier also reflects exactly on this, because Matthijs and other researchers have cooperated with The Guardian in a very long series of articles, and Daphne too, okay, in a very long series of articles that were great, that were really, most of them were absolutely brilliant, read by thousands and thousands of people. So the impact, as Aurelian was saying, is there, it's real. It's true that we live in an ivory tower and we communicate among experts, but it's also true that at a certain point, especially from 2016, what scholars on populism said became relevant for a broader audience. And it's interesting because Matthijs in this interview reflects upon the whole project and says, well, on the one hand, I think it was brilliant because we could bring to a very broad audience all this great research on populism. So why are we doing this if nobody cares? We did it, and it's brilliant. It's great. We loved it. It gave us a lot of satisfaction. At the same time, it creates exactly what you, David, were saying. So it's also partially our fault because this huge project also emphasized populism when maybe the issue at stake was not populism, was nationalism, was the radical right, nativism, opposing LGBT plus rights, etc., etc. So on this regard, I highly recommend Aurelian's interview, of course, as well as Matthijs Rodijn's interview, because this mega project with The Guardian, the populism series, I think, was extremely relevant, and reflecting upon it ex post also, in my opinion, gives a brilliant overview of the relationship between academia, the media, and the broader public.
Daphne, did you want to come in?
Yeah, let me quickly say two things. So one, I think I completely agree. And I'll put it a little bit differently. I think it's a bit of a catch-22, right? Because you know, as much research on parties shows, when we talk a lot about an issue, we increase the salience of an issue. And when we increase the salience of an issue, we then send the people straight to the arms of those who have issue ownership, right? So when we start talking about this hype constantly, we bring it to the attention, the issue gains a lot of salience, and then people, you know, it's talked a lot about, it's talked about a lot, and then people go vote for it. On the other hand, of course, what do we do? Do we not research it? Do we not? So I think there's an issue here, but it just dawned on me as well, like, while I agree, and I have myself been pushing in my own publications and research that we should call it far right. And why don't we call it what it is, right? So if we're actually talking about a far right party, we should call it what it is. But even if we do that, are we also not increasing the salience? So will we, if I call it far right, I mean, let's take the Sweden example. For the first time, we have the breakdown of the cordon sanitaire. Wow, it's a big thing, right? Normalized. We call them populist, the Sweden Democrats. Fine. If we now were to call them only far right, would that have made a difference?
I think that's a great point, and I think, you know, it's not just populist hype. I think, you know, again, I think it's Kaz who shown or discussed in recent work how there is so much more research on the far right generally, you know, however you call it, you know, and there's far more research on the far right than there is on centrist parties that have been in power, right? And I think that tells us something about you know, the kind of, I don't know which adjective to use here, but kind of like the fascination that is like almost kind of masochistic fascination about the far right? This kind of voyeurism, the fact that, you know, not just in academia, but in the media as well, you know, like think of Éric Zemmour in France in the recent presidential election, how incredibly, like, the coverage of him was, even though he was never polling that well. We always knew he wasn't polling that well. And I think this fascination is dangerous, because then we, of course, need research on the far right. We need research on populism, but I think we shouldn't overegg it, because then we exaggerate the reach. But of course, there's lots of things that make us follow these research interests, and not least the way academia is measured these days, and metrics and so on, and who gets citations and where you get citations, and yeah.
On the point about looking at the far right, I do wonder if that's a hangover from sort of Adorno and so on, and sort of, you know, the sort of post World War II, how the hell did that happen? And so there is still this fascination with the far right. It goes on. We're running a little short on time, so I'm going to ask a very quick question and then ask everybody to wrap up. Is the phenomenon of populism we're looking at and we're discussing, that we all seem to know what we're talking about, is that a contemporary phenomenon, or is that something that you know, something that only makes sense post, I don't know, post 9/11, post Afghanistan, post 2008 crash, or is this something for all time? Can we go back and look at the you know, ancient Rome and look for hints of populism?
I don't know about ancient Rome, but sometimes the first populist in history is considered Pericles from ancient Greece, 25 centuries ago. Why? Because Pericles moved to a popular part of Athens, Keramikos, to be in contact with the people and to be perceived as being close to the people while criticizing the elites. And as I said before, if we consider populism as the opposition between the people and the elite, this is as old as history probably, and it's just another phase of democracy. It's just a way of taking decisions. So as a procedure, as an idea, I think it's as old as democracy. When you mentioned 9/11 and all these things, well, I think populism resurfaced a lot in the last 20 years, as it, by the way, did in another turmoil period of the 19th century in the US. So every time there is a big tension socially, culturally, politically, I think populism comes back. It's not new at all. And it came back in the last 20 years, if we want, mostly because I think many people are unsatisfied with the way democracy works, with the outcome of democracy. And every time there is this type of popular unsatisfaction, there will be someone to claim to be the voice of the people and to want to turn things around. So I think this is a moment of really many things happening, and populism is clearly came back, as it always did in this kind of turmoil moments. So, but yeah. That's my take on
that. Aurelian.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I think I've spoken too much. But yeah, I think I agree. And I mean, Margaret Canavan was talking about populism exactly in this way in the 1990s. So you know, I don't think it's new. One of the things that is new from my point of view is, or recent at least, is populist hype, and that's what I've been interested in as a subject, perhaps more than populism itself. In fact, is populist hype, and the way we talk about populism impacts on politics itself. And this, I would say, is fairly new, and I'm not sure it's ever been there before, but yeah.
Daphne.
You know, in the late 1960s, I think Ernest Gellner, Isaiah Berlin, and a few others met at the LSE at a conference called "What is Populism?" that I think is now also a book, but also published in Government and Opposition, if I'm not wrong. And if you look at it, they call it "What is Populist?" and they talk about the challenge of the day, but that's very different to the challenge of the day that we are discussing today. So two things that I think I will conclude. The first is, I think, yes, we can stretch populism, you know, to go back a lot, but then we also run the risk of what we've been talking about all along today, right? That, you know, then it's everything, isn't it? Then it's old, and it's about ancient Athens, and it's about Marine Le Pen, and it's about the Soviet Union. And so it just becomes this vast umbrella term that encompasses everything that we consider to be the challenge of the day. And now just the last sentence to end, I think, you know, I was listening to what you guys were saying about it coming back whenever there is, you know, a challenge or a problem. But, you know, is there not always a challenge or a problem? I mean, I don't know of any society that doesn't have its discontent, right? All societies have discontent. All societies have people who are unhappy, people who disapprove of the system. I think the question is how we manage discontent as a society, which is why I want to end by coming back to Riker. If our way of managing discontent in a society is saying, I know better, I am the will of the people, and nobody else should say anything, then I'm not convinced that we manage discontent at all.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank our contributors, Luca Manucci, the editor of the Populism Interviews, and two of the interviewees of the book, Daphne Halikopoulou and Aurelian Mondon. The Populism Interviews is published by Routledge, and it's available from all good bookshops. And if you don't want to use the big online one that starts with A, bookshop.org allows you to buy it and for some of the money to go to your local independent bookshop. Just a couple of quick announcements from us. Our next event is on November the 25th at the London School of Economics. It's a joint event with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung on understanding right-wing populism and what to do about it, which is a new report by Tim Vlandas and Daphne Halikopoulou. So that's going to be at 5:30 on November the 25th at the Old Theatre at the London School of Economics with a reception afterwards. It is a ticketed event. It will be free and tickets will be available from the 1st of November. Please stay tuned to our website and I'll be shouting about it a lot on social media. We also have an event coming up on December the 13th online again, which is The Lefts and Nationalisms in Contemporary Western Europe. And just to remind you that the call for papers for our conference on nationalism and multiculturalism is open at the moment, taking place next year at the University of Loughborough. Details are on our website at asen.ac.uk/conference. I hope you've all enjoyed this evening. Thank you all very much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event. Good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so